My name is Nathaniel Hayes, and I serve as a park ranger in the Rocky Mountains. I am 34 years of age, and I have held this post for nearly a decade. In that time, I have learned that the mountains are beautiful, brutal, and never to be underestimated. My duty, as I see it, is twofold: to protect the people who visit these wild lands, and to respect the ancient, merciless order that governs them. There are rules that we follow to stay alive, and though they may sound strange to an outsider, every ranger who lasts longer than a season learns that they are not suggestions. They are the thin line that keeps us from joining the long list of names remembered only in incident reports and faded plaques at trailheads. I did not begin my career with any sense of mysticism. I was raised in Denver, educated in environmental science, and hired straight out of graduate school into the National Park Service. My training was ordinary: land navigation, first aid, wildlife identification, backcountry survival. Yet nothing in the manuals prepared me for the unspoken knowledge carried by the rangers who had been here for years. On my first night in the ranger housing at Bear Creek Station, one of the older men, Ranger Dalton, left a sheet of paper on my bunk. At the top, written in block capitals, were the words RALS, TOLIVEBY. There were 13 of them, each blunt and without explanation. At first I thought it was a joke, some sort of hazing ritual. I learned otherwise. The first rule read, "Do not whistle after dark." The second, "Never accept food if it is offered to you on the trail." The third, "If you hear your name in the trees, do not answer." They went on in that fashion. Some practical, some absurd, all of them delivered with the same grave seriousness. I remember shaking my head, folding the paper, and slipping it into my field notebook. Within a week, I would understand why every ranger carried a copy in their pocket, worn soft at the edges like a prayer card. My first patrol was a solo hike up the Timberline Loop, a popular trail that climbs from dense pine forest into high, bare ridges with sweeping views. The weather was clear, the air thin but kind, and I felt that thrill of purpose that comes when a person begins a new chapter in life. I checked campsites, refilled maps at trail junctions, and radioed in updates with the crisp efficiency of a man eager to prove himself. It was late afternoon when I heard it, a voice calling my name. Nathaniel. It came from the trees to my left, faint but distinct. I froze because no one was near me. I had passed the last group of hikers an hour earlier, and they had been headed downhill. The forest in that direction was steep and untracked. Yet the voice had been clear, carrying a tone almost identical to my mother's when she used to call me in for dinner as a boy. Nathaniel. I remembered the third rule. If you hear your name in the trees, do not answer. My rational mind told me it was a trick of the wind, some chance alignment of air currents. But my body obeyed the rule before my mind could argue. I kept walking. I did not look back. The voice followed for several minutes, repeating my name in tones that shifted from pleading to irritated to mocking. I quickened my pace until the timber thinned and the slope opened to ridgeline. There the sound ceased as if cut with a blade. I stood, lungs heaving, the folded paper suddenly heavy in my pocket. That was the moment I stopped doubting. When I returned to Bear Creek Station, Dalton was waiting on the porch. He saw my expression and nodded once, knowingly. "You heard it," he said, not as a question but as a statement. I admitted I had. He asked me if I answered. I said no. He clapped my shoulder and told me I had passed my first test. Then he leaned close and added, "Don't ever think the rules are just superstition. They're the only reason any of us last more than a season." Over the following months, I learned to follow the rules with the devotion of ritual. Some I encountered firsthand. Others I observed in the stories of rangers less fortunate. There was a man named Collins, fresh out of training, who laughed at the first rule. He whistled a tune as he walked the night perimeter near the ranger cabins. The next morning, his boots were found neatly placed on the porch, but he himself was gone. His radio lay beside them, its casing split as if by fire, though no burn marks touched the wood beneath. His name was added to the list. The second rule came to me one autumn afternoon when I was patrolling near the old fire road. A woman appeared on the trail ahead, dressed in hiking gear too, clean for someone who had been out long. She carried no pack, no water, nothing but a small cloth bundle in her hands. She smiled and offered it to me. Inside was bread, still warm as though fresh from an oven. My stomach growled. I had been walking since dawn. Yet the rule was clear. Never accept food if it is offered to you on the trail. I declined politely and stepped aside. She vanished between one blink and the next. Where she had stood, the ground was blackened, the soil cracked as though from drought. I did not speak of it to anyone for weeks. As the years passed, the rules became second nature. Some were simple. Never camp on the valley floor, for the fog there carries more than moisture. Always keep your fire small. Large flames draw attention. Do not stare too long at reflections in mountain lakes. They may not give you back your own face. Others were cruel in their implications. If you come across a hiker who seems lost, but refuses to leave the trail, do not guide them. They are not yours to save. If you hear crying in the canyons, especially the cries of a child, ignore it. Those who go toward the sound do not return. I have wrestled with the morality of these rules. Everything in me as a ranger, as a man sworn to protect visitors, urges me to help. But the mountains are older than our vows, and they do not care for our sense of duty. They have their own laws, and when we defy them, we are punished. I have seen enough graves to know that mercy here is selective. Sometimes the most compassionate act is to walk away, no matter how it shreds your conscience. It was during my 5th year that the rules were tested in a way that still wakes me at night. A group of college students went missing on a backcountry permit. 3 days overdue, no contact, families panicking. Search and rescue was mobilized, and I was assigned to sweep a section of high meadow known as Elk's Crown. It is a place of treacherous beauty where the grass grows in waves like an inland sea, and boulders stand like watchful giants. I was alone when I heard the crying. It was unmistakably a child's sobs, carrying on the wind. the sound pierced straight through me. Every instinct screamed to run toward it, to search until I found the small body in need. But the rule was iron: if you hear crying in the canyons, do not follow. I stood there, torn in two. Then I remembered Dalton's voice. They are not yours to save. My fists clenched until my nails cut my palms, and I forced myself to keep walking the prescribed grid pattern. The crying followed me for an hour, changing pitch, sometimes high, sometimes low, always just out of reach. When I returned to base, trembling, I learned that the missing students had been found alive on another trail altogether. There had been no children in the park. There never are. The crying was something else. By now I carry the rules in my head, each etched deeper than any regulation written in ink. They are my shield, my compass, my constant reminder that survival here is not about strength or skill, but obedience. Yet obedience does not ease the weight of what we lose. For every life the rules preserve, another is abandoned to the mountain's hungers. Perhaps that is the price of balance. Perhaps it is cruelty disguised as order. I do not know. What I do know is that the rules are older than me, older than the service, older even than the maps. We rangers are only the latest inheritors, scribes of a covenant we did not choose, yet must uphold. Tonight I sit in the ranger cabin, writing by lantern light. Outside, the wind moves through the pines with a voice that almost forms words. I keep my lips pressed tight, for to whistle would be to invite company I cannot bear. The rules lie open beside me, edges frayed, ink faded but legible. 13 simple lines that have kept me alive longer than I deserve. Tomorrow I will step into the wilds again, patrol the trails, smile at the families who come seeking beauty. I will warn them about bears, about storms, about altitude sickness. I will not tell them the real dangers. Those are ours to shoulder, ours to face in silence. And when the trees call my name again, as they surely will, I will not answer. The cold months press down hardest in the Rockies. Not simply with snow, but with the kind of silence that eats at reason. By late November, the crowds had thinned, the trails all but empty, and only a handful of rangers remained to patrol sectors that felt more like separate worlds than parts of the same park. Winter makes a man memorize every rule, not because he is dutiful, but because there is nothing else to hold on to. One evening after a 3-day sweep through the northern timberline, I trudged back toward the cabin, legs aching from miles of snowshoeing. The air was still, brittle with cold, every sound amplified. A raven passed overhead, and its wings seemed to snap like breaking branches. I had just started to unpack when I heard footsteps outside. No vehicle, no snowmobile, just steady crunching across the frozen crust. My hand froze on the zipper of my pack. A knock came at the door. 3 measured raps, polite, almost cheerful. I stood without answering. The rules were clear: when the sun is down, do not open the door unless you see the one knocking. And I could not see anyone through the narrow window. The knock came again. Then a voice called out, light, casual, as if it belonged to a fellow ranger. "Hey, open up. It's freezing out here." The timbre was familiar, too familiar. It matched Dalton's voice almost perfectly. But Dalton was 3 ridges south, days away. I stared at the door and said nothing. The voice grew irritated. "Come on. Don't be an ass." A pause, then softer, almost coaxing. "Nathaniel. Please." The way it wrapped around my name was wrong. Like the syllables were slightly too long, stretched over teeth, not meant for human speech. I backed away and blew out the lantern. The knocking stopped. When I woke the next morning, snow lay smooth and untouched across the clearing. No tracks. Incidents like that became more frequent as winter deepened. Some rangers described hearing singing in the trees. Others claimed to see strangers at the edge of their firelight, always offering, always inviting. Once, while clearing a downed log across the service road, I saw a boy about 10 years old standing on the bank. His hair was dark, his jacket thin, his arms bare. He lifted one hand and pointed downstream. "She's hurt," he said. "She fell." His breath did not miss the air. My chest constricted. I almost ran. Almost. But the rules echoed. If you hear crying, if you see a child alone, walk away. My throat closed against my own guilt. As I stepped back to the snowmobile and started the engine, the boy's mouth opened in a wide smile, too wide for his small face. And then he was gone. For the rest of that patrol, I could feel eyes following me through the trees. Dalton later told me, "You don't break the rules for anyone. Not a kid, not a friend, not even for me. If you do, you won't come back. Or worse, you will, but not as yourself." The worst test came with a search mission in January. 2 hikers had been overdue 3 nights. I was paired with Miller, a young ranger who still carried the arrogance of someone who thought rules were optional. He liked to whistle to pass the time, even after dark. Dalton had already warned him twice. The 3rd night out, camped in the lee of a frozen ravine, Miller did it again. An aimless little tune while he cleaned his rifle. The sound barely carried beyond the fire, yet the forest shifted as if it had been listening all along. Wind rose in the ravine, carrying a chorus of whistled notes back to us. Same rhythm, same pitch, but fuller, layered, like dozens of mouths whistling in harmony. Miller froze, his lips still puckered. The fire guttered low. Shadows thickened. I shoved him hard, hissing, "Stop." We sat in silence for what felt like hours, the echoes dwindling into uneasy stillness. At dawn, we packed camp without speaking. Miller's face was ashen. He never whistled again. We found the hikers' packs, days later at the base of an ice chute, arranged with unsettling neatness. Their owners were never located. Miller wouldn't say it, but I could see in his eyes he was beginning to believe. It is not only sound that betrays you here, but sight. In March, as the snow began to thaw, I was checking trail markers near a half-frozen lake. The surface gleamed like steel, catching the early light. I knelt to check my canteen, and my gaze flicked toward the water. My reflection stared back. Same parka, same tired eyes. Then, without warning, it raised a hand. Mine did not. My stomach dropped. I staggered back, heart hammering, and in that instant my reflection grinned with teeth too sharp, then rippled away with the breeze. For days afterward, every puddle, Every shard of ice made me wary. I kept my eyes low, drank from the canteen without hesitation. Other rangers have told similar stories. Reflections smiling early, mouths opening in silent screams, faces aging faster than the real one. A rule exists for a reason: do not linger at the water's edge. The most painful moments are when the rules demand inaction. Once, during spring thaw, I heard a woman's voice calling for help from a canyon below. It was ragged, desperate. "Please!" "I've broken my leg." I leaned over the edge, but the shadows below were opaque, too dark for the time of day. My fingers tightened on the rope in my pack. To do nothing felt monstrous. Yet I knew the rule: do not respond to voices in the canyons. So I walked away. Her screams chased me for half a mile before cutting off mid-word. That night, safe in the cabin, I lay awake with my fists pressed to my eyes. If someone truly had needed help, I had abandoned them. If it was a lure, I had survived. Both truths sat heavy. I have often wondered if the rules themselves are a kind of bargain. Our silence, our restraint, in exchange for being left mostly untouched. Maybe these things, whatever they are, only demand acknowledgement. Maybe they want us to know they are there, that they could take us any moment. And the rules are the flimsy fence that marks their territory. By my 6th winter, I had stopped questioning. The rules became instinct. Step back from water, ignore the voices, never accept, never whistle, keep the fire small. Each time I obeyed, I lived. Each time someone broke one, I saw the cost. Even now I can recall the night I nearly slipped. A blizzard had pinned me in the Southern Watch cabin for 3 days. Rations were gone. Hunger gnawed. The storm shrieked around the walls like a living thing. On the 4th night, I woke to the smell of bread. Fresh, warm, yeasty. Impossible. The aroma filled the cabin, drowning the stink of damp wool and kerosene. My mouth watered, my chest ached. When I sat up, a loaf rested on the table. Golden crust, steam curling from its cracks. I stared until my eyes blurred. I wanted it more than I wanted to breathe. But the rules roared louder than hunger. Never accept food if it is offered. I shut my eyes, curled into my blanket, and did not move until morning. When the first light came, the bread was gone. In its place lay a pile of ash. That day I wept into my hands, not only from relief but from the knowledge that part of me had wanted to fail. The mountains test us that way, not with obvious danger, but with small invitations to break faith. That is how they win. Spring eventually returned, thinning the snow, bringing hikers back to the trails. Their laughter carried across meadows, their photographs filled with light. They will never know the cost of our silence. They will never read the rules etched on paper and carried in our pockets. They will thank us for pointing out marmots, for warning them about black bears, for showing them where to refill water. And we will smile and nod, carrying the weight of all the things we did not say. The mountains are not merciful. They are not cruel. They are simply what they are. And within them, the rules are the only scripture that matters. By late summer, the Rockies had a way of pretending they were gentle. Meadows bloomed with wildflowers. Rivers ran clear and cold. and families filled the campgrounds with chatter that made the wilderness seem tame. Those months often trick visitors into thinking the mountains are nothing more than a backdrop for adventure photos. But for us, the season brought a different kind of danger. Warmth and sunlight only made the rules harder to keep. The first was distraction. When the air is soft and the trails crowded, it is easy to forget that we are watched. That complacency nearly cost us in August, when reports came in of a missing teenager near Eagle Crest Trail. She had wandered from her group just before sunset, claiming she wanted to photograph the ridge at golden hour. By the time rangers were mobilized, the sky was darkening. Dalton and I set out with headlamps, our radios crackling. Half a mile up the switchbacks, I spotted her standing on a rock outcrop, perfectly still. Relief swept through me, until I realized she was not shivering, not shifting her weight, not behaving like someone lost. Her arms were folded neatly in front of her, her head tilted slightly to the side, as though listening to something. I called out her name. She turned, and her face was expressionless, eyes wide. "I'm fine," she said, but the words came flat, like a line rehearsed. Dalton's hand shot to my shoulder, a grip like iron. "Do not go closer," he whispered. My heart kicked hard, but I obeyed. We coaxed her from a distance, speaking gently, until she finally blinked and seemed to break from a trance. She stumbled down toward us, confused, claiming she didn't remember leaving the trail. When we reached the outcrop again in daylight the next morning, there were no footprints in the dust where she had stood, only a circle of smooth stone, as if the rock had been polished by countless feet pressing down in exactly the same place. The second challenge of summer was fire. Tourists built roaring campfires despite warnings, their flames leaping high into the night. I patrolled one campground where the light from a single bonfire could be seen across the valley. That was against every rule we lived by. A large flame is a beacon. I ordered them to douse it, my voice sharper than I intended. They laughed, muttered about overbearing rangers, but eventually poured water until the fire hissed out. That night, long after the campers had retreated to their tents, I circled back. In the clearing where the bonfire had been, the ashes glowed faintly, pulsing as if with a heartbeat. The air smelled not of wood smoke, but of singed hair and iron. I scattered dirt across the pit and whispered an apology I could not name. Sometimes the rules saved us not by what we avoided, but by what we endured. In September, heavy fog settled into the lower valleys. It rolled across the forest floor in thick, white waves swallowing the trees until visibility shrank to a few feet. The rule was explicit: never camp on the valley floor. The fog carries more than moisture. A group of backpackers ignored the warning. They pitched tents near a stream where the fog pooled deepest. When I arrived on patrol at dawn, the campsite was silent. Tents stood zipped, undisturbed. At first I thought they were still sleeping. Then I noticed the silence was absolute. No birds, no insects. Not even the sound of water trickling nearby. I unzipped the first tent. Empty. Sleeping bags still zipped, pads laid out. No sign of struggle. Every tent was the same, perfectly arranged, completely vacant. Their gear was untouched. Their food hung neatly, as though they had followed every ordinary rule of camping. But the fog remained dense, curling around my boots like fingers. I reported the disappearance, marked the site, and left as quickly as possible. Search parties combed the valley for weeks. Nothing was ever recovered. The fog eventually lifted, leaving behind only a strange silence in that meadow that lasted long into fall. By then, I had begun to accept that the rules weren't only warnings. They were boundaries, negotiations between us and something else. You could feel it if you lingered long enough at the edge of breaking one. A pressure in the air, an anticipation, as though the world itself were waiting to see if you would cross the line. And if you did, you weren't punished by accident. You were noticed. One of the younger rangers, a woman named Eliza, learned this in October. She was sharp, competent, eager to prove herself. On a patrol near Shadow Ridge, she came across a hiker who appeared disoriented. The man was standing on the trail, swaying slightly, his face obscured by a hood. He said he was lost, asked her to guide him back. The rule was unambiguous. If you meet a hiker who refuses to leave the trail, do not guide them. They are not yours to save. But Eliza couldn't bear to leave him. She placed a hand on his shoulder to turn him toward camp. The man looked up. His face was blank, featureless skin, stretched where eyes and mouth should have been. Eliza screamed and staggered back, stumbling into the brush. By the time she regained her senses, the trail was empty. She made it back to station trembling, her voice hoarse from crying. After that, she carried the rules like scripture, never doubting again. I think often about the cruelty of such laws. They force us to stand by while others suffer, to turn away from pleas that sound human. But I have also seen what happens when compassion outweighs caution. The mountains do not forgive hesitation. They demand obedience. By the close of that summer season, I understood something else as well. The rules were not only about survival, but about belonging. Each time I followed them, I remained myself. Each time I resisted temptation, I kept my name, my memory, my shape. Those who broke them, sometimes they vanished, sometimes they returned changed. And there are worse fates than death. I remember walking the ridge, one evening, the sun bleeding into purple haze, when I heard laughter behind me. I turned and saw a group of hikers I had passed earlier. They were cheerful, snapping photos. But one more figure trailed behind them, a step out of sync. At first glance, he looked like any other hiker. Backpack, hat, boots. Then I noticed his shadow stretched the wrong way, reaching uphill against the slope of the light. The rule for such moments was never written, but we all knew it. Do not acknowledge what walks just behind. I turned back to the horizon, breath shallow, until the sound of their voices faded. That night, back at the cabin, I added a silent 14th rule to my list: when in doubt, walk faster. It was in that season that I began to dream differently. Not ordinary dreams, but ones that felt weighted with presence. In them, I walked trails I knew well, but the signs were wrong. The paths looped endlessly, The trees leaned in too close. At the end of each dream, I found a clearing where something waited. Sometimes a figure, sometimes only the sense of being seen. I would wake with sweat freezing on my skin, heart pounding as though I had been running. The dreams left me with the impression that the rules reached further than the waking world. Perhaps even in sleep we were expected to obey. Perhaps the line between what was real and what was not mattered less than whether we followed. As autumn bled into winter again, the rules carried me forward. They whispered at the edges of every decision, guiding my steps like an unseen hand. And though I hated the silence they demanded, though I hated the guilt of turning away, I obeyed. Because the alternative was not simply death. The alternative was being claimed. Winter returned with the kind of violence only the Rockies can muster. Snow buried entire valleys overnight. Winds clawed down from the peaks like talons, and every sound seemed sharpened by the cold. The park closed to visitors, and once again only a handful of rangers remained. The quiet was absolute, but never peaceful. We had learned long ago that silence here often meant something was listening. I was assigned to the Southern Watch cabin, a structure built in the 30s, its logs dark with age, and its windows sealed with frost even on the inside. Supply runs came once a month by snowcat, but otherwise I was alone. That solitude was supposed to be restful, a chance to collect data, maintain trails, and write reports. Instead, it became the setting for some of the most difficult nights of my career. The first came in early December. I had just banked the stove and was settling into my bunk when the sound of crying drifted through the walls. Pitched, panicked sobs, the unmistakable cries of a child. They came from the tree line beyond the clearing, rising and falling as though the child were stumbling closer. My entire body moved to respond, years of training urging me to rush outside with a blanket, a lantern, anything. But the rules stood in front of me like a locked door. Do not follow the sound of crying in the canyons, especially not at night. I lay frozen, every muscle taut, the lantern flame casting nervous shadows. The sobs circled the cabin once, then again, then faded into stillness. I slept little after that, staring at the ceiling, guilty for doing nothing, grateful for surviving. A week later, I learned that Dalton, stationed further west, had faced the same test on the same night. He, too, had heard the crying. He, too, had resisted. When we spoke by radio the next morning, he said quietly, "They're testing the seams, seeing who will break first." I asked him what would happen if one of us did. His reply was curt. Then, there would be one less ranger. Isolation gnaws at the edges of reason. After weeks of nothing but wind and snow, even a shadow at the window can feel like company. Caught myself listening for footsteps on the porch, half hoping to hear another human voice. One night, just after midnight, I did. 3 knocks, soft and measured. Then a voice, my own voice, called from outside, "Nathaniel, let me in." The sound froze me to the bunk. It was identical, down to the cadence, the tired rasp. The door rattled gently, as though tested by a hand. "It's me," the voice insisted. "You're not alone anymore. My hand shook with the urge to lift the latch. I almost did, almost convinced myself that loneliness had made me hallucinate. But when I stayed still, silent, the voice soared. It spat my name with anger, then with mockery, then with a guttural growl that scraped like stones. Finally it stopped. I sat awake until dawn, every nerve screaming. The next morning, I opened the door to a line of boot prints in the snow. They began at the porch and ended 5 steps out, where they simply stopped. No leading trail, no return. Just 5 impressions and then nothing. Another rule burned itself deeper into me then. Never open the door unless you see the one who knocks. The snowstorms that year were relentless. For days the cabin was sealed, windows buried in drifts. In that white suffocation, sound carried oddly. I would hear movement above the roof, as though something paced back and forth. Heavy steps, deliberate. Each creak of snow, pressed timber a reminder that the roof might cave. Or worse, that the weight pressing it was not weather at all. Once when I braved the doorway to dig out, I saw claw marks etched across the ridge beam, gouges far too large for any bear. In January, I was ordered to check the condition of the fire. Lookout on Mount Keswick. Abandoned for years but still maintained as an emergency shelter. The climb was brutal, switchbacks buried. Visibility a shifting veil of snow. When I reached the lookout, its single-room cabin stood against the storm, windows dark, door half open. I stepped inside. Dust lay thick, disturbed only by my footprints. Yet on the desk, a notebook sat open. The last entry was dated a decade earlier, but the ink looked fresh. 4 words repeated across the page. Doan, lo W'n. Over and over, in a hand that grew more frantic, until the pen tore through the paper. I felt a tug in my chest, an almost physical pull to glance out the window. The storm cleared just enough to reveal the cliff face below. Against all sense, something inside me wanted to lean over the sill and peer down the sheer drop. The urge was overwhelming, as if curiosity itself were no longer mine but imposed. I staggered back, slammed the shutters, and stuffed the notebook into my pack. Back at station, I locked it in the evidence cabinet. But sometimes I still dream of those words. I wake with the echo in my head, fighting the impulse to look out the window of my own cabin at the ground below. By February, even the radio became unreliable. Static blood through most channels, punctuated now and then by voices I recognized, except the rangers they belonged to were miles away. Once I heard Dalton's voice clear as if he were beside me. Trust the snow. But when I confirmed later, he swore he hadn't transmitted anything that day. Miller, who had survived his first winter, but remained nervous, reported hearing his own voice, calling his name from the tree line. He barely slept afterward. Within a month he resigned, packed his things, and left the service. I didn't blame him. Not everyone can live with rules that forbid trust in your own senses. The storm season peaked in March. I remember one night when the wind howled like 100 voices, each syllable shaped into half, formed words. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sound vibrated through my bones. When I glanced at the stove, the fire had gone out. I hadn't let it. The The coals were simply gone, as though snatched away. I scrambled to relight it, remembering another rule: never let the flame die completely. Small fires keep them at bay, but no fire invites them in. My hands shook as I struck match after match until the stove caught again. Only then did the voices recede, the wind losing its words, leaving only ordinary howls of weather. That was the night I understood how thin the barrier really is. How a single mistake, a single lapse, could tip the balance. As spring crept back, snow melting into swollen rivers, the mountains released their grip little by little. But even as the first hikers returned, their laughter bright and careless, I felt no relief. The rules had not lifted, they never would. They did not belong to winter or summer, to storm or sun. They belonged to the mountains themselves. Sometimes I wonder if the rules are not protection at all, but participation. That by following them, we are playing a role in a ritual older than language. That by turning away from crying voices, ignoring faces at the window, keeping our flames small, we are giving something what it wants: acknowledgement, obedience, proof that we know it is there. The thought unsettles me, but I cannot dismiss it. Because the alternative is to believe the rules are arbitrary, and that those we lost, Collins with his whistling, Eliza with her compassion, the hikers who camped in fog, were punished at random. That would be worse. The mountains keep their order. We keep ours. And between them lies a fragile truce, one mistake away from shattering. Spring never arrives gently in the Rockies. It breaks open like a wound, with avalanches in the high passes, torrents of meltwater turning trails to rivers, and winds that shift from warm to bitter in minutes. Visitors return in waves, eager to breathe mountain air, to photograph wildflowers, to forget that winter ever existed. For rangers, spring means doubling vigilance, not only against natural hazards, but against the subtle tests the rules place before us. In April, I was tasked with inspecting a series of backcountry campsites along the Aspen Ridge. The snow had retreated in patches, leaving the ground damp and spongy. Birds sang in the pines, their calls bright, almost too bright, as if mocking the silence of the months before. Midway along the ridge, I found a campsite abandoned, but strangely ordered. Fire pit cleaned, logs stacked neatly, tent zipped, though the fabric inside was shredded into ribbons. The only thing left on the picnic table was a trail journal, the kind visitors often use to record their days. Most entries were ordinary. Lists of birds spotted, meals cooked, miles hiked. But the last page was covered with a single line, written dozens of times until the pen dug grooves into the paper. Don't let it walk behind you. As I stood reading, the air shifted. The woods grew quiet, all birds falling silent in the same instant. The hair rose on my neck. I turned slowly, deliberately, but saw nothing. Still, I felt it, the weight of eyes, the certainty of something standing just at my back. Every instinct screamed to whirl around, but I forced my gaze forward and kept walking. My boots felt heavy, as if dragged by unseen hands, until I reached the trail again and the feeling lifted. That night in the cabin, I added the warning to my personal list. Another rule, unspoken but clear: do not acknowledge what follows. May brought storms of a different sort. A group of college students had rented one of the park's remote huts, accessible only by a 7-mile trail. They were due out on Monday. By Wednesday they had not returned, and the families were frantic. I joined the search team, trudging through mud and slush toward the hut. When we arrived, the door stood open. Inside, sleeping bags were arranged in a circle, all zipped, all empty. Their boots were placed neatly by the wall. Their packs leaned against the stove. The table bore plates still dusted with crumbs. Mugs half full of tea long since gone cold. But the strangest thing was the ceiling, scratched into the beams. In overlapping letters were dozens of names, the same ones repeated again and again. Names of people not on the trip, some belonging to rangers I knew, some of strangers long dead. We searched for 3 days. Not one student was found. Eventually the case was closed, though their families refused to accept it. I still see their faces on missing posters, pinned at trailheads. The rules could not save them. Perhaps they never knew them to begin with. Later that season, I patrolled near a popular lake where families picnicked. Children skipped stones. Dogs splashed. Parents laughed. The water mirrored the sky so perfectly, it seemed a sheet of glass. I felt a prickle of unease. Then I saw it. Among the dozens of reflections, one did not match. A boy's image lingered on the surface, even after he had turned away. It continued skipping stones, alone, its motions jerky and wrong. I shouted for the family to pack up, claiming a storm was coming. They left grumbling, unaware of the danger. I stayed long enough to see the false reflection pause and tilt its head toward me. Its face was blank, washed of all features. I looked away quick with heart hammering and did not return to that lake again. The worst part of spring is the false sense of safety. Trails look inviting, the air smells clean, and visitors ignore warnings, more often than not. They whistle as they hike, call each other's names across valleys, and build fires that leap into the sky. Each time I hear them breaking the rules unknowingly, I feel a sick dread in my chest. I want to shout, to explain, to hand them the list we carry. But the rules are not for them. They're for us. Outsiders come and go, only we stay long enough to understand the cost. In June, I accompanied Dalton to the old ranger station at Black Hollow, long abandoned but still used for storage. The building sagged under its own weight, shutters broken, roof patched with tin. Inside it smelled of mildew and dust. We were checking inventory when Dalton froze, staring at the far wall. I followed his gaze. There, in the grime, a phrase had been traced by a finger. I answered. The words dripped faintly, as if written in condensation, though the air was dry. Dalton swore softly and turned away. We should leave. Neither of us touched the message, but I thought about it the whole hike back. Someone had broken the rule. Someone had answered. As summer took hold, the tests grew bolder. On patrol near Shadow Canyon, I encountered a hiker who seemed out of place. He wore brand new boots, but no pack, no water. His eyes were pale, too pale, almost milky. He asked if I could point him toward the river. The rule came to me instantly: never guide those who refuse to leave the trail. I told him I didn't know the way, though of course I did. His face twisted into a smile that showed far too many teeth, small and sharp. "You're learning," he whispered. Then he stepped backward into the shadows and was gone. My legs shook so badly I could barely stand. That night, writing in my journal, I realized something chilling. The rules were not static. They responded, they adapted. Each time we obeyed, something out there seemed to acknowledge it. Not with gratitude, but with attention, as though marking us for later. The weight of it pressed hardest in July. Tourists poured in by the thousands. Search and rescue calls spiked. We found bodies more often than survivors. Some deaths could be explained by falls, by hypothermia, by animal encounters. Others defied every report I knew how to write. A man frozen solid on a warm day, frost blooming across his face. A woman found at the base of a cliff. Every bone intact, though she was lifeless. A child who vanished from his tent while his parents slept beside him, only to be found miles away, standing upright in a meadow, eyes open but unseeing. We wrote the reports anyway. We left out the details that didn't fit. And we returned to our cabins at night, clutching the rules like talismans. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if I left. If I packed my things, resigned, and walked away from the Rockies forever. Would the rules stop applying? Or do they cling once learned, following you into ordinary streets, into city apartments, into dreams? Dalton believes they never let go. Once you know, he told me, you can't unknow. The rules aren't about this place. They're about you. I think he's right, because lately, even off duty, I've caught myself obeying. I keep my fires small in campgrounds far from the park. I never whistle at night, not even in the city when walking home. And when someone calls my name from another room, I hesitate before answering. The mountains have taught me obedience, yes. But they've also left me with a fear I cannot shed. The fear that the rules are not boundaries of protection, but chains of ownership. That by following them, I've already surrendered something essential. And yet, even knowing that, I still obey. Because the alternative is worse. I've seen what happens when people break them. By late autumn, the Rockies settled into that uneasy stillness before winter. The hush that feels less like rest and more like a held breath. Days shortened, shadows stretched. And even the visitors seemed to sense the shift. They hiked quickly, glanced over their shoulders more often, left campgrounds earlier. For us rangers, it was the season of watching. We had survived another cycle, obeyed the rules another year, but the mountains always waited for a mistake. It was during one of those shortening days that Dalton handed me a folded sheet of paper. Edges yellowed, handwriting faded but legible. It was the same list I had received my first season, the 13 rules. But this one had a 14th line, scrawled in smaller script at the bottom. When the rules change, you'll know. Don't resist. I asked him what it meant. He only shook his head. Not for me to say. Just keep it close. His eyes, usually sharp and steady, looked haunted. The change came sooner than I expected. I was patrolling near Granite Pass when the air grew unnaturally still. The birds went silent, the wind dropped, and even the insects seemed to vanish. I stood alone on the trail, heart thudding, when a voice rose from the trees. It wasn't calling my name this time. It was reciting the rules, word for word. Never whistle after dark. Never accept food offered to you. If you hear your name, do not answer. The voice was calm, deliberate, almost amused. My blood ran cold. Each rule echoed back at me, not as a warning but as a taunt. And then came the last line, one I had never heard spoken aloud. When the rules change, you'll know. I turned and fled the pass, stumbling over rocks, lungs burning. By the time I reached the cabin, my hands were trembling so hard I could barely light the stove. That night I dreamed of the list written in fire across the sky. In the dream, a hand reached out and crossed one line off. The sound of the pen scraping woke me gasping. From then on, small shifts began to appear. Fires that once felt safe now drew uneasy attention, even when kept small. Shadows seemed bolder, stretching closer to the cabins. The crying in the canyons didn't fade when ignored. It grew louder, pressing against the eardrums until blood wept from the nose. The rules still worked, but less cleanly, as though the terms of the bargain had been renegotiated. Dalton admitted he'd noticed it too. The rules aren't commandments, he said one night over weak coffee. They're agreements, and agreements expire. He rubbed his temples as if the thought itself hurt. Every few decades, maybe centuries, the mountains demand new ones. The idea terrified me. What if the next rule required something worse than silence? What if survival meant giving more of ourselves away? The first test of the change came with Miller. Though he had quit, I heard his name again when a report crossed my desk. Missing in a city hundreds of miles from here. He'd gone out for groceries, never came home. His apartment door was found ajar, shoes neatly placed by the mat. I remembered the boots on the porch that first season, Collins's boots, waiting without their owner. My stomach twisted. The rules had followed Miller beyond the park. Dalton's warning was true. Then came the night at Bear Creek Station when all the rangers on duty gathered for a storm briefing. We were reviewing emergency plans when the radio crackled. A voice came through. Not static, not distortion, but clear. It listed our names one by one. Every ranger present, even the ones who had been gone for years. Even the dead. We sat frozen, staring at the radio as though it were a mouth opening in the dark. At the end, the voice spoke in chorus, layered tones overlapping. One rule more. Then the line went dead. For weeks afterward, unease hung over us. We waited for the new rule to reveal itself, scanning the forest for signs, listening for hints. Nothing came until the incident at Elk's Crown. A group of hikers was caught in an early snow squall. I was sent to locate them. The storm pressed hard, visibility near zero, snow stinging my eyes. Then, through the blur, I saw them. 5 figures moving single file up the ridge. I hurried closer, shouting, but they didn't respond. When I drew near, my stomach dropped. They weren't hikers. They were us. 5 rangers, faces pale, eyes vacant. each step matching mine a moment later, like reflections walking free. One of them turned its head, and though its mouth didn't move, I heard the words inside my skull. The new rule is already here. I stumbled back, half blind in the storm, and when I blinked the figures were gone. The real hikers were found days later, safe, unharmed. But I couldn't shake the encounter. I didn't tell the others. Not then. The new rule finally showed itself in late October. I was on night watch, lantern low, reading through my logbook. A knock came at the window. Not the door, the window. 3 sharp raps. I froze. That had never happened before. The old rule said never open unless you see the one who knocks. But the window offered no view, only reflection. I stared into the glass and saw my own face looking back. Then it smiled. Slowly. I hadn't moved. The knock came again. My reflection's hand rose and tapped on the inside of the pane from my side. That was when I understood the new rule wasn't about refusing strangers. It was about refusing yourself. I backed away, heart pounding, whispering the list under my breath like a prayer. My reflection tilted its head, still smiling, until the lantern guttered and went out. In darkness, the glass went blank. Since that night, the rules feel alive in a way they never did before. They aren't static lines on paper. They shift, they adapt, they demand more. We rangers live in constant anticipation of the next change. Dalton believes the list will double before our time is done. 13 rules may become 26, each one a leash drawn tighter. Sometimes I wonder what happens if we refuse altogether. What if one day, every ranger tore the list and walked into the trees singing, whistling, answering every voice? Would the mountains claim us all? Or would the bargain collapse, leaving whatever waits here free to spill beyond the ridges? I don't know. None of us do. But I carry the list everywhere, edges worn soft, letters fading. Each time I unfold it, I half expect another line to have appeared. Maybe one night I'll wake to find the paper blank, the bargain reset, survival stripped away. Until then, I obey. I obey because I must. Because the cost of rebellion is written in the absences. Collins's boots. Miller's empty apartment. The students who never left the hut. I obey even though each rule feels less like protection and more like surrender. The Rockies hold their silence tonight. The wind is calm, the sky scattered with stars. In the stillness, I can almost believe the world is ordinary. But I know better. I know the silence is listening. I know the rules are listening. And I know, sooner or later, another one will come.